Hi, everybody. Welcome to the new episode of History 102, which is about the French empires, with our co host, Austin Paget. Have you been attaining a
Oh,
mindset of inner love and inner self acceptance?
no, only French love and French superiority.
Well, the French have a lot to love, so that shouldn't be hard.
It is the language of love, they
It
say.
is. Um, I think you mean adultery. Um, you know the whole thing with the French government's banned paternity tests for decades because it might disrupt the family?
Oh, wow, because they knew. They were like,
Yeah.
okay, this is going to blow everything up.
Adultery has been a really long tradition in France where the next episode we're covering is the Napoleonic Wars, and when you read Napoleon's biography, merch. Show the
Mm,
merch. We have
merch.
click the link in the description. We have mugs,
Yes.
we have maps, we have many different things.
Lots of
Um,
primary colors.
exactly. So click the link below for the merch. Apologies for the derailment, but it's interesting that, oh yeah, so in the Napoleonic Wars, Josephine was cheating on Napoleon, and Napoleon asked his minister Talleyrand what he should do about it, and Talleyrand said, caring about getting cheated on is lower class behavior. He said, if you act like you care, you're going to appear lower class. And that's not my attitude. I think that creating a society like that's disgusting, but that was a French thing that wasn't really common in other European societies. And it's interesting on a genetic basis how much adultery varies by society. So, as a rule, in most of Anglo Saxon history, as in the English speaking world, you have a 1% adultery rate every generation. So, once you get to 100 generations, at least one of them is probably going to be illegitimate. But in the modern Netherlands, it's 10% every generation.
Wow.
And I'm thinking the French will be up by the Dutch's numbers, but I can't imagine that the current 10% number is that old. Because if your number's that high for long enough, you're not going to have a functioning society.
So this is where all the continental and French romance, sexual, more degenerate society narratives came from the English perspective.
Yeah, so the English and the French hated each other for obvious reasons because they were the other's biggest political competing power. The French called the English perfidious Albion, where they saw the English as hypocrites and cunning, and they called the English a nation of pirates and shopkeepers. The English, meanwhile, thought the French were women. They thought they weren't masculine. They thought that they were deceptive and not and overly emotional and those things.
I can't think of a cooler compliment than pirate and shopkeeper. I mean, I'm pretty sure I've described myself that way unironically.
Yeah, because Napoleon said that I can beat the English, they're a nation of shopkeepers. And Hitler also said the same thing. And what do Hitler and Napoleon have in common? They lost the English.
Well, the shopkeepers, turns out, can make boots and weapons and stuff like that pretty
Yeah,
fast.
the Nazi command in World War II, the thing I said about America is the place where razors are made, not tanks.
Turns out you can convert a razor factory.
Yes. Um, so the thing with the French Empire, and one of the interesting mechanisms, is that different societies frequently have multiple empires. So when we talked about the British Empire, there's the first and the second British Empire. The first based around North America, and the second based around India. In Germany, you have the three Reichs, or the Holy Roman Empire, Prussia, and then Nazi Germany. France has this to the highest level of any empire I can think of, unless you're counting China or Persia, which have just been there for thousands of years. And the way I'm going to phrase this is the first French Empire was roughly 1620 until 1765, or roughly the start of the 17th century until the French Revolution. And I like to say that that French Empire was built off the Nantes to Quebec axis. The Second French Empire was based around wherever Napoleon happens to be, and it was a continental European power that stretched out to Russia. And that was 1798 or 1799 until 1815. It was less than a generation. Then the Third French Empire was they got Algeria in 1830, but after the war, after the loss of the Franco-Prussian War, the French carved out this huge empire in West Africa and Vietnam and a few other places. So I say that that's the Dakar-based empire. Dakar is a city in Senegal. So first French empire based out of Nantes to Quebec from 17th through 18th centuries. Second French Empire, start of the 19th century, based around Napoleon. Third French Empire, mid 19th to mid 20th centuries, built out of West Africa.
You got it. And for this episode, we're focusing on the first one, 1600 to mid
We're focusing
1700s.
on all three.
Okay, all right. We got a lot to go through.
It's easier than it sounds because there actually aren't that many populous territories in the French Empire. It's not like Britain where you have India and America and those places. Because the biggest issue with France as a power was that it is a strong generalist, but it's not an extreme player. And what I mean by that in video game terms is if you look at the European continent, the English are completely optimized to be a colonial empire. They're an island. They're facing out into the Atlantic. England's got a really strong naval geographic advantage. Germany is built up to be a land power, and whenever Germany strayed from being a land power, it was a strategic error because they're in the middle of the map, and Germany has to be good at land fighting to survive. The Russians are naturally geographically built to be this enormous steppe empire transcending Eurasia. And the thing with the French is that France probably has the best geography out of any European country, where it had the most people of any European country by far in the pre-industrial world. It had the most fertile lands, barring places like Russia. It's filled with navigable rivers. It's in the temperate zone where it stretches from the Mediterranean through a more cold climate. So France is very blessed in a lot of ways. The issue, though, is that the French were never able to commit to a single strategy because they would always get pulled into one direction or another and would be incapable of consolidating their gains. And that's the thing we'll talk about later, where France was a generalist, where it could be a land power, it could be a sea power, it could be a manufacturing power, it could be a cultural power. But the thing is that the French didn't really commit to any one given strategy, so they'd experience success in one strategy. France would have a political crisis or a crisis of leadership, which is how each of the three empires died. France would lose that empire. Then another generation of French leadership would form another empire based around a different context. And when you're looking at the French Empire, you're looking at an innately incredible nation consistently get stopped from reaching greatness, where France is a great country, but they were always on the edge of breaking through the threshold the Anglo-Saxons reached to becoming, because I think the Anglo-Saxon and the British Empire, it's been like a new Rome, where Rome, there you have these great empires like Rome or the Arabs or the Chinese who build this international order based around their culture. And for France, when you look at the end point of their empire, it's just the hexagon, a few African countries that speak French, and a small group of less than like 5 million people in North America. So when you look at the French Empire and you look at its long-term consequences, it's lots of thrashing about and epicness without the long-term impact that you'd see in Spain, Britain, or Russia.
Right. That is interesting. I wonder if the source of the adultery stuff is the big disconnect between the large rural population and then the urban of center of power in France, because kind of like how China, it has these wealthy areas and then the rest of the country is kind of underdeveloped rural, and then Thailand is like Bangkok is basically the entire economy, and then there's a giant rural agrarian area,
Yeah.
higher percent than normal. So I'm wondering if that created this like larger cultural gap, which would lead them to associate, strong values found in the countryside with um, lower class behavior, just based on the
Yes.
economic situation.
That definitely happened. It's ironic that this video starts basically when the last video ends. The last video ended in the 17th century, right when this video starts. And the French are a very dynamic people, so once they conquered the modern hexagon, they had to spill out of France. Populations are either waning or waxing, and if you're not actively growing, you're shrinking. And a dynamic nation will spill outside its borders organically. And Western Europe in this time period had a lot of dynamism. And what you're describing definitely happened, where there's a word I love a lot that I wish people would know is urbanity. And urbanity has two meanings. One is it's a term for ghetto black populations. The other term, the one that I use it as, is urbanity is when you are so sophisticated, you feel as if you are not too cool to live. Or you feel as if you're too cool to live. Because I had a realization last year where I'm like, wait, in this current society, you're supposed to be too cool to support your country. You're supposed to be too cool to believe in God. You're supposed to be too cool to have kids, to have meaningful relationships, to
Mm,
do adventurous stuff. And I'm thinking, people today think they're too cool to live because humans are animals, and most of our actions are basically animalistic. Most of the human condition is working, sleeping, socializing, sex, status games. And so what happened in France, and this is a roundabout way of saying it, is that France was the first country in Europe to become urbane. And that was due to the cultural effects of the establishment of Louis XIV's court, where Louis XIV, and this is probably the most important event in French history, besides the initial unification under Philip Augustus, is that France became a system where, in order to counteract the enormous regional diversity, they unified everything through Paris. And then the King of France, in order to keep the previously incredibly powerful nobility down, he made the nobility move to Paris and party with him. And they would live in these expensive mansions. They'd make up new fashions. They make up new cuisine. This was a cultural golden age, an invention of so many things in modern cuisine, a lot of modern art, modern philosophy with the Enlightenment. The wealth of the French court dropped in Paris made France the cultural hegemon of Europe. People in Russia and Romania and Prussia, the nobilities there spoke French before they spoke German or Russian. The Russian nobility spoke to each other in French, not Russian. Same thing as like even the Moldovan nobility under the Ottoman Empire. So French cultural dominance spread across all of Europe. But it was at the expense of their dynamism and of their long-term potential. Because when you look at England, England's greatest technological revolution and sociological revolution didn't occur in London. Isaac Newton was based out of, I believe, Oxford or Cambridge. Then the Industrial Revolution happened in the Northwest, around Manchester, Liverpool. The Scottish Enlightenment was in some ways more important than the English Enlightenment. So when you're looking at the British Isles, which didn't have this, where the aristocracy was divided across the social structure rather than just being in London with the king, Britain gains dominance from that, where for France, everything got siphoned into this urban culture, and the urban culture became progressively more degenerate as time passed, which rubbed off on the population.
right. It's the same thing as the EU. People are attracted to the immediate benefits of, the regions not fighting, or a unified trade zone, or something like that. But then it doesn't take very long for that centralized structure to prevent adaptation that would have sent you on an actually larger growth track absent that.
So this is a funny transition because the start of the First French Empire is one of the few things that was coordinated. It's one of the last major shifts in France that didn't occur from direction from Paris, where the First French Empire, or North America, occurred due to merchant interests in Normandy and Brittany, the northwest of France, Normandy, Brittany, Poitou, where the French populated North America at the exact same time as the English did. I think the settlement of Quebec and the settlement of Jamestown were like 2 years apart.
So you mean the English part of France?
Yes, the area that is genetically and ethnically identical to British people, because in Northwest France is genetically closer to the British than it is to the French. Um, and it's funny that having lived in Canada, I mean Canadian citizen, the Quebecois caused so much trouble for them to be genetically identical to Anglos. Because it's funny, people are like, oh, we should accept Somalians, we should accept immigrants from Guatemala. And I'm thinking, if the Dutch whites of South Africa viciously fought the British whites of South Africa, and the Dutch and the English are genetically they're
Mm.
genetically identical practically. Lots of Danish people or Dutch people, when they take genetics tests, they come up as English because they're that close. Like I have a Danish friend where a lot of his friends come up being half English, even though they're pureblood Danish. And that was the older 23andMe data. Their 23andMe's data has gotten better since, but that whole northwest region of France, it their descendants have caused so much strife in Canada. It's just the existence of Quebec has become the most difficult thing in Canadian history for all of Canada's period since independence. Where I was reading through Conrad Black's History of Canada, and the entire thesis of the book, and this has more to do with Conrad Black's political things he cares about, is it's all about these various treaties to keep Quebec inside Canada. So the most popular and I think famous history of Canada today is all about negotiating to keep Quebec from leaving. So you could write the history of Canada as just the hassle of keeping Quebec from leaving.
It is really funny that both the Royalist French and the Royalist English, after fighting for hundreds of years on the continent, ended up stuck together up in the snow while the free populations took the rest of it.
It's because we took the good land because we wanted it. Um, the so settlement of Quebec, um, that occurred on a roughly similar timescale to England, to the British North America, although they were completely different in scale. So at the time of the American Revolution, the 13 colonies had like 7 million people, and Quebec had 100,000 people. So the 13 colonies got a vastly larger amount of settlers from Britain as the French Canadians got from France itself. And the large reason for that is that England called the settlers of America undesirables. That was a term they used at the time, where they saw the losing factions of the English Civil War that would migrate to America when their faction in England lost, like the Cavaliers and the Puritans, the religious fundamentalists, again, like the Puritans or the Quakers, the Scots-Irish backwoods tribes, the Irish, poor people, debt slaves, convicts, all of which went to America. They were called non-productives, not undesirables. The non-productives built the most successful society in history. The thing with the French colonies is that Louis XIV was obsessed with power, which is one of the things you see in his policies in Europe, where he was all about unifying France due to the horrific civil wars when he was a teenager, in which the nobility backstabbed him. So the French and the Spanish both built their colonial empires around, we want to filter for a specific type of person, and if you don't fit this cookie cutter, you don't get to migrate to the colonies. So in order to move to Quebec, you had to be a Catholic, and their ideal was that they would recreate feudalism in Canada, where they divided up the St. Lawrence Valley between these people called seigneurs or lords, and these lords were supposed to bring peasants in from France and then populate this region. And so the entire St. Lawrence Valley around modern Quebec became settled by these French settlers really quickly. And they settled along the banks of the river, where there was this thin strip of settlement down the valley. And then once you left that, it got depopulated very quickly. And the thing, though, is that social structure it wasn't able to actually hold in America because the land was so scarce. Sorry, the labor was so scarce against the land that these seigneurs or lords ruled in abstract. Well, in reality, the peasants who moved out there, um, they were pretty free. They weren't as free as British Americans, but they were definitely freer than Europe. And so the ruling class of Quebec was a combination of the seigneurs or the lords and then the no, and then the church. So when the British conquered the region, they were able to strike a deal with both of those demographics so that Quebec became one of the most loyal provinces of the British Empire, more loyal than even the British Americans.
So that's how it originally fused with the English up north, was just that it was easy to get. You only had to interface with the leadership, basically.
So what happened is that Anglo-Canada was populated by Americans, where Anglo-Canada was not settled by people straight out from England. The Nova Scotia, that area was an economic dependency of Boston. So Yankees would migrate into Atlantic Canada and they settled it. And then you had some other groups like the Scots and the Germans, where northern Nova Scotia is practically pureblood Scottish, where they have their own variety of Scottish music, which it's very good, Cape Breton. And the English depopulated that area in the War of Austrian Succession, where there was this French population in what they called Acadia, or modern New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. And in the 1740s, 30 years before the conquest of the rest of French Canada, the British took out Acadia, and they forcibly migrated nearly all of the French population out of the province to replace them with Anglos. And this is one of the bits we forget about colonialism, where we say colonialism was hyper-racially motivated. But no, the English would happily kick out French settler populations to move in English settlers. So Americans filled the void. And interestingly, those Acadians, they sailed down the coast of the 13 colonies. Every British colony rejected them, so they sailed all the way down to French Louisiana, which the French had claimed, but they hadn't populated yet. So these French Canadians from modern Nova Scotia ended up in Acadian to Cajun. And so they're the origin of Cajun culture.
Right. What would have happened? Because I think one of the reasons why they picked Quebec strategically was the rivers and then the Great Lakes. And they thought that that might eventually spit them out on the Pacific and then tie their empire trade zones into Asia, which maybe would have been a more valuable strategic move. But the river bent and spit them out in a swamp.
Yes. It's
Yeah.
This is one of the really funny things where the Europeans got the terrain, the climate of North America wrong, where the French, part of the reason they went out to, so the French and the English probably knew about Newfoundland before Columbus discovered the New World. I've spoken about that in the Age of Exploration video, but we have significant evidence that the Europeans knew about North America before Columbus, but with the way that society worked, where governments would keep their navigational charts secret, that they didn't tell anyone till Columbus called the Europeans bluff, where it moved in game theory terms, where a game where it was the incentive to hide information to once the Spanish showed up and something's here, it immediately flipped over to a game where the incentive was to claim it. So that's why within 3 years of Columbus discovering the New World, the English happened to reach Newfoundland and the Portuguese happened to reach Brazil. And the
Right.
thing with that is that for Newfoundland, for both the English and the French and the Basques, they were sailing off the coast of Newfoundland because there's this oceanic deposit. There's this massive banks of fish called the Banks of Newfoundland, which had these huge amounts of just fish that apparently it was just incredible. It was fish everywhere. And since then, we've basically fished the banks of Newfoundland into extinction. None of it's left now, which is sad. But the English and the French both claimed half of Newfoundland, where they had some fishermen on Newfoundland, or a big island that's way out into the Atlantic. And the English had the eastern half and the French had the western half. But it was super lightly populated, and the English took the whole thing in the War of Austrian Succession. But the thing with Quebec is that they thought it would have a climate comparable to France's because they were going straight west and they didn't think of the Gulf Stream, where the Gulf Stream makes Europe is significantly north of America. So
Hmm.
Philadelphia sits at the latitude of Naples and Smyrna and Turkey and Spain. New York City sits at the latitude of of central Italy. And then so when you go straight west from Brittany and Normandy, you're going to hit Newfoundland. You're going to hit Quebec. And the French thought if we just sail west, it's going to have a climate similar to France. And they really got screwed over in the first winter in Quebec. The French settlement of Quebec was just as hard as the British settlement of Jamestown, which nearly failed. And when the British settled in Jamestown at the same time, they thought that Virginia would have a climate like the Bahamas. They thought it would be a tropical climate where they grew fish, not sorry, where they could grow sugar and those kinds of crops. But also, they didn't know how heat actually worked because they were English, so they didn't pack anywhere close to enough liquid or beer for them to drink. So in the British settlement of Newfoundland, they burned through their entire beer deposits very quickly because they were drinking so much just to get through the heat of the Virginia summer.
That's really strange because I would think they would pick up at least some knowledge that climate didn't stay completely consistent to the climate zone from exploring all around Asia. But the North American exam climate variations per latitude are pretty extreme compared to the rest of the world if you think about it. Like
Yeah.
I guess we have some kind of unique ocean currents. And it was also even colder back then. Like I don't know exactly how much colder, but the Northeast was way colder in the 1600s
Yeah.
than today.
It was
Probably
significant.
like 2 degrees Celsius colder or something.
That's one of the things David Hackett Fisher talks about, and it was pretty significant where the northeastern US, interestingly, the area around the Chesapeake and Virginia had a climate roughly comparable to today, but the northeastern US and Canada, it was dramatically colder due to the mini ice age, and the St. Lawrence would freeze over pretty regularly, where modern Boston had a climate equivalent to Newfoundland in the 17th century. So what that means is that Quebec must have been icy cold in this time period.
Yeah, I can't believe I was wondering why they settled there. I guess, like you said, they didn't know and they made a mistake and they made a strategic commitment. And then the lakes and the waterways were enough to keep them there. And the English were kind of dominating the coast. So it's kind of like maybe if we go above and then through the water, it's our way into the continent.
The Quebecois are also just really tough. Their motto is, I think their motto is "We're going to survive." It's some equivalent of that. And yeah, the French Canadians are tough folk because they've been there. They're a sort of old world population in the new world. And what I mean by that is that in the old world, you get these populations where people have been there for centuries. People are tied to the land. There's a pre-established class and religious structure. And it's a peasant society. One of the things my dad told me growing up is he said Americans aren't peasants because even an American farmer or poor person has a general understanding about how the market works and some degree
Hmm.
of worldliness. If you're a farmer in Ohio, you're not a peasant because you understand the complexities of your agriculture, the market works. But in most of the world, peasants they're just kind of NPCs. They don't
That's
change.
so
Yeah, go
mhm.
ahead.
That's so funny because when my French friends visited in upstate New York, we were driving and there were some farmers out in a cornfield or something, and they said, "Ooh, look, les paysans." They're like, "Oh, look, peasants."
Yeah, yeah,
And I feel like I don't know if it's exactly connected, but it's funny. They
yeah.
still use the word peasant for farmer. Yeah.
The French look down on peasants. The French look down on manual labor in a lot of cases, although the French have put an enormous amount of their money into supporting their agriculture, which I think is actually a good decision for a variety of reasons. But the thing is that after the British conquered Quebec, their entire merchant class were Anglos, where the Quebecois didn't really get off the land, and the Quebecois had a sort of um, they had a stultified, not really modern outlook where it was super Catholic. Until the 1960s, Quebec was one of the most Catholic places in the world, where the Quebecois had a lot of kids. Not that many French moved over, but then the French that did come to Quebec, they had a lot of kids. The numbers were really high. And Quebec had this fascinating event in the 1960s, which is one of the most rapid rises in atheism anywhere in the world. Where over the course of a single decade, Quebec went from one of the most Catholic societies in the world, easily one of the most religious places in the Western world, to being one of the most atheist places in the Western world. Where over
They
the
had a
course of
delayed French Revolution.
exactly over the course of a single generation in the 1960s, the Quebecois went from uh, one of the most religious populations in the Western world to one of the least.
And this is where Trudeau's political dynasty comes out of, right? His
Yeah.
dad probably was
So
the end point of that movement.
the thing with Trudeau is he is the son of probably the most important Canadian prime minister of our lifetime.
Fidel Castro. Speaking of infidelity and the French,
His mom was Anglo. He's Trudeau's half Scottish, half French, um, and so his dad's one of the most, probably the most important Canadian prime minister of our lifetime, and that's the thing Americans don't notice. But Daddy Trudeau established the structure of modern Canadian politics, where Daddy Trudeau's stuff was all about unifying Quebec with the Anglos to produce this thing that Canadians pundits call the Laurentian elite, where the modern Liberal Party that has dominated Canada for my entire lifetime. The Canadian Conservatives are such cucks. It's
hmm
disgusting. The Liberal Party are based out of urban people in the urban leftists in the St. Lawrence Valley who will vote for the Liberals no matter what, Trudeau the younger has been able to continually get reelected until he wasn't, because this demographic gave him fanatical support. So one of the
mm,
biggest fault lines in Canadian politics today is that the East is a sink for money and the West produces more money. We're in the current equilibrium where Daddy Trudeau was capable of unifying Ontario, the Maritimes, and Quebec into a single coalition at the expense of the West, is the West is getting progressively more dissatisfied with a ruling coalition whose main focus is keeping Quebec part of the country, which if you live outside Quebec, you never even process Quebec's existence. When I was in Ontario, I don't think I met a single, besides like one or two hitchhikers, I don't think I met a single French Canadian there.
yeah, it is pretty. I mean, because it's the intra-British differences in the U.S. is one thing, but it's pretty stark when it's French and English,
Yeah.
different populations. And it's really interesting how the politics. So you basically had the atheist movement in the French zone, which means there was less of a Catholic resistance to merging with the like the English Protestants. Um, and so basically the liberal atheistic English teamed up with the French atheists, and then that created the source of unity. And
Yes.
today it's breaking down where increasingly the French populations and the Albertan, um, like Scotch Irish, are increasingly aligned towards decentralization, whereas previously the French aligned with the Puritan English towards centralization after their atheist movement.
So Eastern Canada, that's New England ancestry. Quebec is from Brittany and Normandy. Ontario was settled by people from Pennsylvania and upstate New York. And so when I lived in Ontario, there were lots of streets that had similar place names as Pennsylvania, and you would notice similarities in behavior. You'd notice similarities in architecture. So there is a cultural link from Pennsylvania to Ontario. Then, once you get further west, you are correct that Alberta is heavily Scottish ancestry. The Scots predominate the further west you get, although there's a huge Scottish impact on Canada in total. You got a lot of Germans and Ukrainians and Romanians in the middle, because the Canadian government had this active mission to settle the Canadian plains with Eastern Europeans, so Americans wouldn't settle it. It's comparable to how the rail companies in America literally went to Scandinavia and recruited Scandinavians to populate the American plains because Anglos didn't want to move to Minnesota or the Dakotas because it's too cold. And then once you get further west, it's British Columbia, similar demographic makeup to Alberta, but it's English, and huge amount of Asians in Vancouver right now. But the reason that Canada exists is that the French settlers were monarchists and socially conservative. And to be socially conservative in our world is to be a socialist. Because we come out of the age of socialist dominance. Well, the big filter for Anglo-Canadians was people fleeing the American Revolution. And so Canada's always prioritized order over chaos, and America's always prioritized chaos. So there's this huge diaspora out of America with the success of the American Revolution to Canada, and they, in that short period, immediately demographically overpowered the Quebecois, where just the single loyalist migration from America to Canada after the Revolution, past that point, the Anglos were already a demographic majority, and it kept growing, where as of now in Canada, you have 3 English speakers for every French speaker.
Right. They basically were like, okay, we lost America. Let's go take over Canada just by pure numbers.
I felt bad we didn't cover Canada before because I was considering we haven't talked about Canada in really any History 102s except for really sparingly. And I felt bad about that, but I'm glad we were at least able to cover some of Canada. And in the future I'm considering making like a British Commonwealth History 102 where we cover Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. But I'd have to read a few more books on the Antipodes, especially. But First French Empire you were correct when you say it's a water-based empire, where their goal was to reach the Orient, and they thought North America could be this tiny Japan-like strip, and on the other side of it is the Pacific to sail to Asia. But that didn't work, and so they were sailing up the St. Lawrence, where they thought that this river would lead to the Pacific, but they actually got to the Great Lakes. And the French really used water to their advantage in the First French Empire, where the French Empire stretched from with the two great navigational triage points of the North American continent. That being New Orleans at the mouth of the Mississippi River, and then Quebec at the mouth of the St. Lawrence. And in between them, and this is part of the reason why North America is a geographically blessed continent, you can sail the whole distance from New Orleans to Quebec with a few different points where you take your canoe out. So you go up the Mississippi from New Orleans. The Mississippi it's over 1,000 miles. It stretches from New Orleans, which New Orleans sits at the latitude of Egypt, and then it goes up to Minnesota. So that's Egypt to like Central Europe. And so you sail up the Mississippi to where the French had a big base in southern Illinois. I keep forgetting his name. I think it's like Kaskaskia. And then to the west of it, the French had a very tentative hold on the Great Plains, where most of the French Empire was not populated by French people, but the French said, we claim the entire Mississippi and St. Lawrence Basin as our property, and then they'd periodically talk to the natives and trade with them and that stuff. So most of the French Empire was a bluff, but then to finish the journey, sail Mississippi to Illinois, get off at Chicago, which was a city made by the French, then sail through Lake, it's not Lake Illinois. What's the lake that Illinois is on? There's Superior, there's Huron, there's Erie, Lake Michigan. So
okay.
You go through Lake Michigan, you go to Sault Ste. Marie, a French city. Actually, I'm just going to show all. So New Orleans to St. Louis, a French city. St. Louis to Chicago, a French city. Chicago to Sault Ste. Marie in Michigan, a French city. Sault Ste. Marie to Detroit, Detroit, another French city.
Mm,
Detroit to Buffalo, which was Fort Niagara, which the French also founded. Fort Niagara up the Lake Ontario until you hit Quebec. And so the French were really good at seeding these forts in the middle of the North American wilderness, where so many of America's most important cities are of French origin, whether Detroit, Chicago, St. Louis, New Orleans, Des Moines, or in French, Des Moines, some monks, Sault Ste. Marie, Buffalo, Louisville, Kentucky, Quebec, and probably loads of other cities that I think of these through the French names. It wouldn't surprise me if loads of cities that have had Americanized. Pittsburgh was a French city initially. And Mobile, Alabama, French city. And so you'll see these French names in North America, and you can see that the French had this huge empire that was staffed by fur trappers, where the main agent of the French Empire was the fur trapper, which is funny because much like the Cossacks, the fur trappers left France for freedom because they were highly individualistic people who didn't like the state or the government. And the fur trappers would mate with the local women. And you had these large mixed race populations where Canada's only major Indian war was with the Métis population of Manitoba, who were mixed race, half French, half local tribes. And so these French Canadians would go out deep into the continent, going out to Montana. The French in the 18th century were out in the Rockies. So the French were out in the Rockies as mountain men, possibly even reaching the Pacific decades to over a century before the Anglos did. And they built up these relationships with the natives where the natives trusted the French more than the English because the French didn't have enough people to displace the natives and take their land. So in most cases, with a few exceptions like the Cherokee or the Iroquois, most of the natives in North America in this area were allies of the French. And so it's why the war where the French lost North America is called the French and Indian War.
right. It's funny to think of if France took North America, it might look something more like South America, but French mixed with North American Indians instead of Spanish mixed with South American Indians.
That's a good point. Yeah, it's hard to imagine that white people wouldn't steamroll North America because it's so much fertile land that was lightly populated.
Right.
But also lots of things don't happen in history. I'm surprised the Chinese haven't steamrolled Siberia and filled it with 100 million people. It's surprising that Russia didn't develop Central Asia more. There are lots of things that could have happened in history that didn't. And so across the French Empire, to go from one axis to another, in New Orleans, the Cajuns settled there and they saw a complete cultural shift. Where I was in New Orleans a month ago, and I like to tell people, New Orleans is one of my favorite cities in America. I tell people that New Orleans is an extension of the Caribbean French culture like Haiti, more so than it is the rest of North America. Because Louisiana is this strange aberration where the rest of the American South is very Anglo culture, very morally conservative socially. The culture of the American South is not a quote spicy culture, so to speak, although they do season their food well. French Louisiana was the blackest place in the North American continent in the year 1800. It was 80% African. And so when you look at the Cajuns were less than 20% of the population. And they were Africans pulled from Senegal, from the other French St. Louis. There's the city of St. Louis in Senegal, which was also a French colony. St. Louis is one of the most important French saints. He was one of their kings in the 13th century, who they revere. And so New Orleans is fascinating, whereas also the place in the North American continent. When I say North American continent, I mean not including the Caribbean islands. It's the place in the North American continent where a white person was most likely to die of disease. And I guess it's just the bottom of this swamp. But New Orleans was the most important city in North America for a little bit. Philadelphia was more important in numbers and in industry and science, but New Orleans was geostrategically the most important place, which is why New Orleans was fought over so many times and traded hands between different European powers.
Right. It gave the French an entrance into the continent in the areas where the English didn't dominate the coasts, and it connected their loop, basically. So, key part of their strategy. I didn't know the French founded Chicago. That's really interesting. It's really because that's the big meat packing, beef city, cowboy funnel point, and then they were out on the Great Plains 100 years before. It's funny to think of with their fascination of American cowboy culture that they actually glimpsed that a little bit before us.
Yeah. When I was in Brittany, they have Brittany, which seeded most of the French Canadians, where the Cajuns are from Poitiers and the west coast of France, and the Quebecois are from Normandy and Brittany. They have cowboy restaurants. And it's weird to see their concept of
Hmm.
cowboy culture is this mix of Quebecois and Anglo-American culture. And it's funny that the French shit on America a lot, but you can tell that they're obsessed with us. Where French youth, they listen to rap, they eat hamburgers, they dress in blue jeans, they think like Americans. With their words, they say that they hate America, but with their actions,
Hmm.
they're obsessed with us.
A good example of this is I went back to France to see some of my old friends. Maybe I was 18 or something, and we were in Lyon, and it was like, okay, what are we gonna get? And I said, you know what, baguette sandwiches, and they were like, McDo. And so we went to McDonald's. And then we also would go to a place growing up called Buffalo Bill's in France, which had, a big Indian with a cigar and a bunch of cowboy stuff, and they served ribs and things like that.
Yeah. When I was in France, I saw this clothes store called Quarterback. It's just the name quarterback as a clothing store.
Oh yeah. So they wear American. A big fashion in France is to wear American high school senior sports jackets. Even older people will do it. So they don't have like an actual badge on them, but it's like the varsity sports
Yeah.
jacket.
It's funny what things are considered low class in America get popularity outside here because they don't have the cultural context we do. When I was in China, I was
Hmm.
staying with the host family, and it was this wealthy family. And the kid, who was a teenager, he was wearing a Snoop Dogg t-shirt, but he didn't know who Snoop Dogg was. And when I was in
Right.
China, I saw these stores that just had every single hat for every American baseball team.
When I was in China, maybe only 10 years ago, I saw multiple times, many times, people walking around in American flag clothing, American
Yeah.
flag pants, American flag shirt, whatever.
Yeah. And it's funny that the French, I saw that they too liked going to McDonald's, but one of the things they don't get is that fast food is highly class correlated in America. So if you're upper or middle class, you basically won't get fast food. And as of now, the lower classes are being squeezed out of fast food due to cost, which is why the fast food companies are not doing well. But I always find it funny when Europeans would be like, I have some extra money. I'll go to McDonald's, and they see McDonald's as expensive too, which
Yeah.
it's Euro poors.
Hmm.
And then like, they're looking forward to it, and I thought I would never look forward to going to a McDonald's in America.
It's because McDonald's is part of the boomer economy.
Yeah,
So even if it's cheap, it's never cheaper than like rice and chicken street food or whatever local food supply
yeah,
chain
yeah,
is established.
yeah. Um, so French Caribbean. This is more important than people give it credit for because the French, much like the English, had staked a claim in the Caribbean in the 1600s, and a lot of the craziest pirates were French. The island of Tortuga off the coast of modern Haiti, and Haiti was majority white at this point, that was the biggest center for piracy in the 17th century. And over time, the French realized they could grow sugar in the Caribbean, which made these islands incredibly valuable, especially Haiti, where Haiti is large in the Caribbean context and small in the American context. And Haiti was worth probably something equivalent to Saudi Arabia today. It was such an incredible asset because I like to say sugar is to the 18th century what oil is to today. And so the French's islands, like Haiti, which they called Saint Dominique, with Guadeloupe, with a few other places in the Lesser Antilles, the French just filled it with black people for the sugar agriculture. And sugar is the most one of the more horrifying crops to grow, where you work 18 hours a day, 7 days a week, in the peak season, and then you burn the sugar in these enormous blast furnaces to melt it down. So that the logic of the sugar trade: import slaves, work them to death, buy new slaves off the money you work to death. So it's one of the more morally abhorrent things we've done.
The plus side is you can bite right into the sugar cane, and that's a pretty nice boost. You can't do that with cotton. So
Yeah, and so in the French and Indian War, when the English conquered Quebec, the French were willing to offer all of Canada in exchange for the island of Guadeloupe. And Guadeloupe is in the Lesser Antilles. It's one of those tiny islands you forget about. I can name every country in the world off the top of my head, except the Lesser Antilles, which is the area north of Venezuela, and the Pacific. I can never memorize all of the Lesser Antilles or the Pacific, and frankly, I have no reason to. But so with the French and Indian War, where First French Empire was crushed by the Anno Mirabilis, and the same year that made Britain the world superpower was the year that destroyed France. Where the Anno Mirabilis in 1763, the French lost all of their possessions in continental North America and in India, where the French had colonies in India, and there was definitely a time when the French could have conquered India, where much like the British, the French colonies were established by basically VC capital, where it was you had the French East India Company, you had the settlement of Quebec, which was another company, and French East India Company. There were several points where they had a leg up on the British, where they held the south around Tamil Nadu, as well as having lots of allies with the local Indians. Because much like North America, Indians and Indians, North American Indians and subcontinent Indians both worked with the French because they were less of a threat than the English. Because the French East India Company was significantly poorer than the English one, where the British were better at trading, although the French did have a larger army. And under Clive, who was a brilliant British commander, he was able to wipe out, firstly, the Indian armies that were working with the French at the Battle of Plassey, and then the French forces itself in South India, where the British conquered all of the French's possessions by the end of the 7 Years' War. And if the French had won in India, where they were doing really well at the start of the campaign, they could have, France would be a great power. If France had conquered India, which was one of the wealthiest places of the world, that would have completely changed the history of the world, because it would have shifted. France would become an Indian Ocean power. They would have an infinite amount of money to prop up the L'Ancien regime longer, all that stuff. But the British won in India, and then in the same year, the British defeated the French in Quebec at the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, where Wolfe, the British commander, Quebec it's the only major fortified city in North America. The city is inside walls. And so the British they had to take Quebec before the winter started. So what Wolfe found is that there was this pass to get behind the walls of Quebec, where they could load cannons up there and attack it from a different angle. He went up to this pass, beat the French army there, and took Quebec. What happened was that in an instant, the French lost their entire North American empire, where they kept Haiti and they kept the Antilles, but everything east of the Mississippi went to Britain, and then the French gave everything west of the Mississippi, like New Orleans or St. Louis, to the Spanish for like 20 years, because the Spanish were under the same monarchy as the French were, the Bourbons. And so the first French Empire died practically within a single year. So the only French colonial possessions left were in the Caribbean and a few forts along Africa.
Did this impact their ability to import lumber and build ships and decrease the competitiveness of their navy? Because that was a big North American resource.
Perhaps. Um, the
They
French had a
probably had
pretty
it somewhere, but yeah, go ahead.
So you in Europe you got lumber from Norway and Scandinavia. They were the big
Mm,
export for better types of lumber. You had to get it from North America. So the hardwoods were from the Caribbean and the tropics. Then America had, I think it was oak and several other trees where there was a sticking point where New Hampshire was a huge New Hampshire was a huge origin for oak production for the British Navy. And one
mm.
of the instigating events of the French Revolution was the Americans saying, "No, Britain, we're not going to make oak for you. This is oak for us.
Ah,
You got to grab
yeah,
your stick. You got to
that's a
grab
big
your
power play. Yeah,
yeah.
I don't have a stick. I need a big stick.
You're not wizard
Um,
maxing.
exactly. It's hilarious that the French and Indian War. There were two French and Indian wars happening at the same time. I guess this is why they kind of
There are
call it the first.
more,
Well, because they were fighting the Indians in North America and in India at
and
the
in
same.
Europe, where
There were Indians in Europe.
oh, you mean you're fighting
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
you're
But it
fighting
goes
two Indians
broader.
at once.
Right, exactly. But you're right, they were fighting in Europe also, so it was like a world war. And it's interesting to think of the colonies, because from our perspective, what would be the most valuable colony does not match up to theirs, because we're thinking of legacy, which is like America, Canada, the populations that grew, and then it was more valuable areas to own later on. But in the colonial period, they really valued those Spice Islands, right? Which is why the
Yeah,
Dutch traded Nutmeg Island for New York. And like you said, the French were more interested in their sugar plantations than in all of North America. And this is why India is so big because it's like the biggest spice island. And of course, it's the biggest prize, the jewel of the British crown, the biggest thing the French are fighting over, the most consequential fight, because it's the origin of colonialism. The whole point was to get to India.
yeah,
So it makes sense that it started with India and it ended with India, which was the last significant colony for the English to get rid of.
yes, and that's a good point. The the first French Empire. Oh yeah, I wanted to say this. I always find it hilarious that the thing that started the Seven Years' War, where the Seven Years' War was an incredibly important war in India, it solidified the British control in Europe because it Frederick the Great kept Prussia alive and as a great power. That was a huge war that was really influential because it meant modern Germany could later unify. Which, if that didn't happen, it would have changed everything. And then in North America, I find it funny that this enormous conflict was started by a young George Washington trying to take Pittsburgh from the French. Because I'm from Pennsylvania, and I'm always shocked that this foreign power settled Western Pennsylvania, where the Anglos had to take Western Pennsylvania from the French, where the first attack on Fort Duquesne failed. Then Braddock, who was this British commander, he brought this field army across the Appalachians to Pittsburgh, which were all slaughtered by the French. Then the attack afterwards was able to finally take Pittsburgh. So the French were able to knock the English out of taking Pittsburgh multiple times, and the French also fought really hard for upstate New York, with places like Fort Niagara and Fort
Hmm.
Oswego. So these places that I don't even think about, they seem like home.
Fort Niagara is huge. It's a big stone. It looks like a castle you find in Lisbon or
Have
something.
you ever been to Fort Ticonderoga?
That was the one I was talking about,
Yeah,
Ticonderoga.
that's
That's what I
huge.
meant.
That's on Lake Champlain. Um, and yeah, it's insane. And the so end of the first French Empire. I think there's some detail I'm forgetting here, but I can't remember it. Um, Then you see this period of soul searching and heartbreak in France, where the French saw the loss of the Seven Years' War as deeply humiliating, and it stung at them. Where the French Revolutionary generation, which occurred a generation afterwards, a big part of the momentum for the French Revolution was a sense of betrayal that the L'Ancien regime had lost to the empire out of incompetence. Because the French
Mm,
military was all based off the nobility. And so people thought the nobles are driving this country to hell. And one of the big motivators for the French Revolution also was that the French funded the American Revolution, where the British and the French were in near constant war for over a century, from late 17th century until the early 19th century. It could be described as a 100 years war between the 9 Years' War, the War of Spanish Succession, the War of Austrian Succession, the 7 Years' War, the American Revolution, the French Revolutionary War, Napoleonic Wars. And so whenever one of them had issues, the other one tried to butt in. As an example, a big reason the British lost the American Revolution and they could no longer wage an offensive campaign is that when France declared war on Britain to support the American colonies gaining independence, the French were threatening to invade England itself and also the Spice Islands. So the British had to pull out their offensive forces from the 13 colonies to protect either either the Sugar Islands or Britain itself. And the French Navy was pretty good by world standards. However, pretty good is not good enough when your dominant rival has the best navy in history. And the French would fight with the British, but consistently the British had control of the oceans, where,
mm.
however, the French scored a naval victory over the British that became incredibly historically decisive at the right moment, that being the Battle of Yorktown, where after 7 years, the American Revolution had bogged down into these wars, into guerrilla campaigns, where the big crux of the American Revolution was America was too big for the British to take, but at the same time, the British had too disciplined a military for the Americans to wipe them out. And so after years of wandering around the American South trying to capture each other, the British walled themselves off on this isolated peninsula in Virginia, and they were operating off the assumption, which was normally correct, that the British Navy would protect them. What then occurred is that the French wiped out the British Navy, surrounded the British force, and since they were walled off by both the Americans who controlled the bottleneck of the peninsula and the French control of the Chesapeake, that British army was wiped out and America got independence. However, the cost of supporting the American Revolution is what caused the French Revolution, because their debts had piled up to a point where they defaulted on their currency because they realized they wouldn't be able to pay it off.
I would disagree a little bit with the fact that it was a cause. I think that's more narratively inserted because I think it represented 3% of the French treasury, but it was the big political talking point. For example, like with Ukraine, we spent like $200 billion on Ukraine. It's a big political talking point. It's a source of revolutionary fervor, but it's not the real reason that the financials of the system would
I
collapse
agree.
or that people are poor, etc.
The real
Um, yeah.
the real reason was the series of bureaucratic and monopolistic incentives that the French government built from Louis XIV onwards, where the French Revolution was reaping what Louis XIV sowed in the mid 17th century, and France had so many issues between most upper class people didn't pay taxes. There was a complete legal clusterfuck on every single level of French society, and also, this is a huge difference in Britain and France. The French government, when they had a financial crisis in the early 18th century or the Mississippi crisis, what happened was that the monarchy supported France had this company. France and Britain both had financial crises in the early 18th centuries. Britain's was the South Sea crisis, and that was a financial bubble that destroyed the British economy because it was based upon the assumption that Britain would be able to make a legal deal soon where they could trade with the Spanish Empire or the South Seas. That was completely incorrect. The Spanish never made a deal. And so the entire British economy, or a large part of it, was shoved into this false assumption that they would get this trade deal with the Spanish that they never did. For the French, they had another comparable bubble about settling Louisiana with French settlers. And the thing is that Louisiana is not the kind of colony where you can go there, get a lot of gold or spices, then bring the profits back to Europe. Louisiana is the kind of colony that takes decades to build up as a settler society. And so the French blew their economic load on that. The thing, though, is that in the British case, they maintained property rights and just said, sorry, guys, mistakes happen. And that resulted in confidence in the British economy. In the French case, they sided with the scammers trying to populate Louisiana. Then they would confiscate money from the public to pay off the debts. And they purposely diluted the currency, and they purposely broke property right laws to support their buddies, which destroyed the French government's ability to raise money until the French Revolution, because the French government had this consistent pattern of not respecting property rights, not paying off their debts, and not maintaining a constant currency.
What's the point of going to live in the snow if you're not going to be that much more free, or in a swamp if you're not going to be able to escape some of those dynamics? I know they tried to make up for the lack of organic settlers by doing things like they had the King's Daughters, where they sent like 3,000 women into a colony, and the population doubled from like 3,000 to 6,000. But those kind of things aren't enough if you don't have the organic
Yeah.
incentives.
I've used this example before, but Vauban, who was Louis XIV's commander, he was Louis XIV's strategic genius who worked under him, where he made several incredibly prescient claims. The first is he said that France needed to have the agricultural revolution, which they didn't, where the English and the Dutch were able to double their quality of life. They're using the agricultural revolution in the 17th and 18th centuries to make food dramatically cheaper. And France, that didn't happen, so the French peasants careened more towards starvation and complete poverty. Vauban also said he designed Louis XIV's star forts, which were the best forts in the world. He was mostly he was a mathematician and a fort designer. Vauban also tried to reestablish the tax code, and he wanted to make a fair tax code more based off the English standards, and Louis XIV kicked him out for that. But Vauban also said, if we send 10,000 people a year to Quebec, which was less than the British were sending, that there will be 200 million Quebecois in the year 2000. And that turned out to be accurate, and it's incredibly prescient, where the British the British commanders were Pitt the Elder, the British Prime Minister during the 7 Years' War or the French and Indian War, as well as the North American leadership, people like Ben Franklin, Washington. They said, whoever controls the Ohio River Valley controls the world, because they knew that it would get populated. So they said, we need to control the Ohio River Valley, and Pittsburgh is the entry point for that. So we need to seize Pittsburgh, because Pittsburgh is where three rivers meet together, and it's also at the edge of the pass from across the Appalachians. So the British were aware of the importance North America would have, and the French never really figured it out, where Louis XIV waged like 7 wars on his eastern frontier just to get Franche-Comté and Alsace, which are areas that are the size of like New Jersey and Delaware combined. As they're like Maryland. And so he wasted all this time and effort in European wars, which was a consistent failing of European powers. The Spanish did it too. Many others did it. Well, France could have used that time and effort, where France had a significantly larger economy, population than England's did, but because England played its cards smarter colonially, the English built up a global empire.
And it was a little easier to do being on the island, right? They can kind of sit out of the continental scuffle. There's less historical desire for Alsace-Lorraine, competing over Alsace-Lorraine. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
We're on the Second French Empire now, which I'm not going to cover that much because our next video is on the Napoleonic Wars. What I will say, though, is that with the fall of the l'Ancien regime, or the monarchy, you saw a complete political clusterfuck that was French revolutionary politics, where France went through probably a dozen government systems between right-wing parliamentary democracy, left-wing parliamentary democracy, removing the king or keeping him as a puppet for years. You saw a triumvirate. You saw like communist councils. You saw a a women's advocacy group or the Jacobins take over power, military dictatorship, empire. If you look at a 20-year period, France went through all the political systems.
Mm-hmm.
And the interesting thing about that is that the Second French Empire was European focused, where the French Revolution resulted in a nation in arms. And what that means is that the French invented total war, where they would say, we are a society where all the young men have to fight, the women have to work on the home front to make industrial materials. The old men need to work too, and so should the children. And that ideal wasn't reached. But their ideal is that everyone will serve the state. And their symbol was the beehive, because they thought we want to turn people into sort of beehive animals. That was their ideal.
That's just like leftists today who are like, look how bees operate, look how ants operate, and
Yes.
collectively. And it's like, we're not bees. It's
Lefti-
funny they use that same example.
Leftism scarcely changed since the French Revolution. It's the whole take that the Jews invented the left. Almost every single take you'll see a shitlib make today, someone would make in 18th century France. They believed in the blank slate. They were atheist. They believed in Reddit-style rationality. They believed in progress. I mean, Saint Simon. Saint Simon's he is one of the most underrated thinkers ever, where he was a thinker in France at the era of the French Revolution. And his ideal was we needed to make a society where the experts become a new priest class, where you have secular rituals, and it's all about making the new man who is stripped away from family, culture, ethnicity, sex, where Saint Simon talks about trans concepts of trying to turn from a man to a woman. He talked about you need to establish a mythology of the science. Thinkers of his generation talked about using a war of liberation in the third world to send these third world hordes to liberate the first world. And any given idea you'll say, French thinkers 250 years ago, like Saint Simon, believed.
Yep, and the English were not too far behind them, sharing a relatively similar religious and cultural backdrop, minus the differences. So yeah, like we said, if it's the shadow of Christianity, then obviously it's organic, predictable development within the culture, and you see flashes of these same things happening throughout all the last 2,000 years. Same ideas,
MAGA
just becoming kind
facts.
of more crystallized on either side. And it's interesting. It switched after they lost their. I never put it together. It was the loss of their colonial empire that shifted their focus to continental warfare
Yeah.
and total warfare and nation states. So basically, this was the origin of the world wars trend
Yes.
because you had Napoleon leading to the unification of Germany and then the large state continental total war.
I read an interesting book by an author called Bell about the Napoleonic Wars, which is called The First Total War. It makes that exact claim, where the first French Empire was an aristocratic empire because France's ruling class were aristocrats. Although it failed at implementing aristocracy outside Europe, the second was a statist empire based around, firstly, worship of the state and then secondarily worship of Napoleon. And so, to simplify this, the first wave of conquest, which occurred under the Directory, where Napoleon was a commander on the Italian front, where he practically single-handedly conquered all of Italy for France, which is why he became popular enough to later become emperor and launch a coup. The French conquered everything west of the Rhine River, where they installed these, they made them legal parts of France, but they also installed these puppet states like the Batavian Republic, the Cisalpine Republic. They weren't actually republics. They were military dictatorships governed by France. And interesting side note here. Napoleon invaded Egypt largely because he was bored This was 1799, where Napoleon was the most popular figure in France, and he didn't want to launch a coup yet. So he just told the French government, I want to invade Egypt with my own private army. They gave heads up. And so Napoleon invaded and conquered Egypt from the local Mameluke governance, where he tried to establish an enlightened state. And he even conquered as far north as Syria through Palestine. And there's a few important historic notes. The first is that this invented the field of Egyptology. And
Mm.
19th century Europe and into the early 20th century was obsessed with Egyptology in large part because through the cultural importance of Masons, there was a profound influence from Hermetic philosophy. And the Hermetica is a philosophic tradition that stems back to Egypt. It was the Greek rendering of Egyptian values. And when you look at the US currency and the US government symbolism, it's completely covered in Hermetic symbolism. So this was a huge idea at the time. So they studied Egypt to see the origins of these ideas. And the French scholars in Egypt, they found the Rosetta Stone in this time period. And so the Rosetta Stone's how we got the hieroglyphs. They brought obelisks back to Europe. They brought Egyptian artifacts because the Europeans didn't really know that there was a much greater ancient civilization in Egypt. And the French maintained their relationship for Egypt for a while. They got kicked out after a few years because the British under Admiral Nelson defeated the British fleet at the battle. Nelson under the British defeated the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile. And so Napoleon had to strand his army in Egypt, mostly to die, while he fled back to France on a smaller fleet. But the French built the Suez Canal. And this was kind of a dick move, where the French built the Suez Canal with the understanding that they would conquer Egypt afterwards and reintegrate it as a colony once again. The British said, psych, thanks for all the work. Egypt is ours now. And
Why did the French build canals so much? Didn't they start the Panama Canal too? Mess
so
that up.
the French have a kind of autist tendency inside them. You can see it when you talk to French men, and French philosophy. The French have sort of autistic logical obsessions where Anglo-Saxons try to mediate our worldview through common sense, and the Germans try to mediate it through whatever ideology that they have at that given time. For the French, they build their ideas off reason. The problem is that reason untrammeled from common sense gets pretty silly. And so you'll read French philosophy, and I think a significant amount of French philosophy is just a shit test. It's a shit test or it's intellectual masturbation, where they're just trying to prove how smart they are with no relation to reality. So the French have these. The French invented a lot of mechanical stuff. A lot of the biggest inventions a century or more so ago were the French, and so the French have this. They like trains. They like trains and canals.
That's funny. Right, the train joke. You can totally get that analogy. Um, eh, yeah, I forgot what I was going to say about it, but that's hilarious.
So the British seizure of
Oh
Egypt
yeah.
caused the Fashoda incident in the late 19th century, where it wasn't clear World War One had to happen, but it was unclear who would be on whose side. Where the British and the French nearly had a war between each other in the 1890s over this skirmish in the land between Sudan, and the Central African Republic. I like pointing this out because how the hell were these two European countries that have a border with each other nearly starting a war over the Central African Republic? Because the French were trying to unify their entire Saharan empire, where they're trying to go across all of the Sahara through Sudan, Egypt, from Dakar out to Djibouti. France had this tiny area called Djibouti in the Red Sea down by Ethiopia. Their goal was to connect Djibouti out to their West African empire, and the British said, no, this is ours. And the French backed down in Fashoda, although it definitely could have caused a war, because Britain and Germany were allies at this point. So if they fought Britain, the Germans would attack their eastern flank, and they knew they'd lose that war.
Oh, so that's why they never kind of engaged directly with Britain. I was wondering, it seems kind of similar to how stable the proxy war dynamic is in the modern era. Like you can have proxy wars all over the world for 50 years against someone and still never have a direct conflict. Was it kind of a
So
similar dynamic with France and England?
they waged pretty constant war until the Napoleonic Wars. Then, after a few decades, Britain and France switched over to being good allies because they were first scared of the Russians, where the British and the French fought together in the Crimean War and a few more wars against the Russians. Um, and then they were scared of the Germans together. And we
Hmm.
don't give Bismarck enough credit for delaying World War One because Bismarck, Germany's minister for a lot of the 19th century, he built up these brilliant strategies about keeping Europe in equilibriums that would not start wars. Because his logic was that Germany should avoid wars when possible, when it wasn't in Germany's interest, because
Hmm.
Germany's position made them strategically weak. So Bismarck did a lot of things to stop war, and he always said, "You're not going to have a war." He said there are five great European powers. If you can be
Hmm.
on whatever a side of those three are, you'll be fine. If you have three powers gang up on you, that's when you're screwed. And so Bismarck, he purposely kept Europe from having a major war like World War One. Then Kaiser Wilhelm, in his foolishness, did
Hmm.
things that got Germany to end up in a really bad place of waging a three-front war in World War One, where Kaiser Wilhelm Bismarck went to a lot of effort to make Russia Germany's ally, and then
Hmm.
Kaiser Wilhelm threw that away because he wanted to conquer Eastern Europe. Then Kaiser Wilhelm also destroyed Bismarck's alliance with the British because Bismarck had said, "Hey, Britain, you're a colonial power. We respect your decision in that. We're a continental power." Kaiser Wilhelm wanted the best navy in the world as well as African colonies. And that terrified the British and made the British work with the French and the Russians against Germany because the British's thought process was if Germany has this navy, they can attack Britain.
Aren't the entangling alliances what led up to these big wars blowing up?
So,
The,
yes, but at the same time, said entangling alliances had kept Europe at peace for longer than it should have. The fact that there was
right.
nearly a
Hmm.
century, 99 years from 1815 to 1914, when Europe had very few major wars, is historically unnatural. People like to say, how come the Roman Empire fell? The real question is, why didn't it fall way earlier at a smaller scale? It's like when you look at a century of peace, have some
Hmm.
friggin' gratitude for the people who made sure that century of peace happened. It's why
Yeah,
I
especially
try to
for the. Mhm.
I try to
Go
express
ahead.
gratitude the Cold War didn't get hot for that reason.
Right, especially for the people alive in the time. And the Cold War is hard to see as not being just catastrophic in itself, no matter when it erupts, just because of the technology and the weaponry. But yeah, you could still conceptualize it as a fragile strategy, and maybe there was no way out of this emerging entangling alliances. Because you see the point, like, well, Liechtenstein was the only part of Germany that didn't join Bismarck's confederation, and they're doing pretty well now. But if they were all separated, I mean, it probably would have centralized anyways. There's a lot of
I don't
pressure to compete.
I don't want to get into this because it would take me a while to explain, but I definitely think World War One was necessary. I don't see a
Interesting.
Europe where it doesn't happen. But so Second French Empire, I'm going to phrase it in these terms. There were three lines in Europe Napoleon tried to hold because Napoleon made himself first consul and then emperor of France. Um, And the first line is the Rhine through Italy, or the former Frankish Empire. These are the borders I think France can naturally hold. I think
Mhm.
Napoleon could have turned Western Europe into an extension of France. However, the second line is Prussia to the Black Sea with Moldova. So Napoleon was never able to fully subjugate the lands in the first and the second line, where
Mhm.
he had to wage like five different wars against Austria and Prussia, where he would consistently beat those countries. But the issue as well was that he never had the men to occupy them. And this huge issue with the French in this war was the French just didn't have enough men for this. Napoleon was really scraping the bottom of the barrel at the end of the war because he just didn't have the young men to fight. And the French were pretty good at getting other people inside their empire to fight for them. They'd have huge Italian, German, Polish armies, especially with Napoleon's attack on Russia. But those men weren't loyal in the same way the French were, where Napoleon's empire didn't work due to the simple calculus that there were not enough French to conquer all of Europe. And Napoleon made a few other decisions where he attacked Spain, which was his only real ally, because he was getting annoyed with them. Napoleon tried to conquer all of Europe at once, and it backfired. But the third line, which is the AA line the Nazis talked about, Astrakhan to Archangel, which is the limit of European Russia, Napoleon's attempt to invade Russia, break past the second to the third line, was insane. Where Napoleon's invasion of Russia is what undid his empire, because he went in with the largest army in European history up to that point, and only a few thousand out of hundreds of thousands of people, only a few thousand made it back. And after that, Napoleon could have won, but he was fighting a defensive campaign. And so after decades, imagine if you're a French guy, 1789, the French Revolution starts. Then the Napoleonic Wars ends in 1815, and then after that, it was a profound economic recession across Europe. So if you're 18 years old in 1789, and then 25 years later, it's the Battle of Waterloo, and then there's economic recession, congrats, kid. Your entire youth has been spent in war and poverty.
Right. Yeah, there's probably a silver lining there somewhere, but
it was the glory where
that's a brutal.
It was the glory where, as I've read from various authors, I've gotten a relatively good psychological portrait of what Frenchmen at this time period were like. Where de Tocqueville, writing in the mid-19th century, said, for our grandparents or that generation, he said they were innately more individualistic, more libertine, and also more heroic and dramatic than us today. De Tocqueville talks about how the rise in religiosity, the Napoleonic Wars, the Industrial Revolution had made the average French person more industrious and more moral, but had gotten rid of a lot of their personal character. And the book by Bell, he says that the main emotion that glorified the French's conquest of Europe under Napoleon was glory. French men were happy to fight for glory. And so if you had shown the French Napoleon, they would say, all of this suffering was worthwhile to attain glory, which is the highest good.
Right. And they needed a pretty strong motivation because, like, after Russia, I think they lost 5% of their population in some of those Napoleonic Wars, but like 25% of the youth.
Yeah.
So you can't do that many times.
Yeah. And it's awfully anticlimactic, where Napoleon's story ranges from Egypt to Moscow, and Moscow to the Atlantic, and then finally to the tiny rock of St. Helena, where he spent his last few years under British capture. But Napoleon's the next episode. He deserves his own video. And so 1815, you see France is once again pushed back to the hexagon, where at this point the French even lost Haiti, because during the French Revolution, there was enough instability in France that the French were incapable of holding Haiti, because Haiti was 95% black, and then not even the final 5% were white. It was a lot of mulattoes, where whites were a tiny minority in Haiti, and they were on top of this huge, genuinely horrifically treated black population. And there was a period where Haiti was under local white governance, where there was a bait and switch where the French Revolution abolished slavery, then Napoleon brought slavery back. And this was a sticking point in Haiti where they did not trust the French would actually give them freedom. And the rhetoric of the French Revolution, when black slaves heard it, they thought, me too. And So Haiti was one of the most brutal wars I've heard about in history. Dan Carlin talks about it, where you hear stuff about cannibalism, burning your enemies in vats, putting your enemies on spikes, and there was a tremendous amount of brutality, with Haiti devolving into a failed state. But under the leadership of Toussaint Louverture, a local slave leader who is very good at his job, the Haitians were able to beat the French. Where Napoleon even sent an army of, I think, 20,000 guys to conquer Haiti under a lot of Polish troops, because Napoleon had split off Poland from its previous conquerors as his own independent, as its state under his governance, and 80% of them were wiped out by disease in the first few months. So the Haitians were able to defeat a French field army, and Haiti, after it gained independence, being the only black governed state in the New World for over a century, is it immediately devolved into being a failed state, where North and South Haiti became independent countries, where North Haiti was under mulatto leadership, or half blacks, half whites, who enslaved the black population, and then South Haiti was under a local black warlord who forced the rest of the population to work as slaves.
Right. And the French didn't exactly leave them with any great legal traditions to work off of. And it's
Yeah,
a complete disaster to this day. I think the last person who tried to conquer it was Hillary Clinton.
the last person who tried to
Um,
conquer it was Lord Miles.
oh, nice. He's next. Yeah. Maybe
Um,
he'll fix the mud pies.
yeah, it's also funny to compare the so there are these charts where you look at tree cover, Dominican Republic versus Haiti, and Haiti has no trees. Well, the DR is covered in trees. And it was because the French imported black slaves for sugar agriculture, where they packed all the population into Haiti. And in the Dominican Republic, it's the normal mestizos with some black ancestry. And so Haiti was overpopulated, and they lacked government systems or tradable skills in the tropics. Haiti is one of the most cursed nations on earth, if I'm honest. But
Well, that the cannibalism reminds me of they're eating the dogs, they're eating the cats.
yeah,
That was
yeah,
specifically in reference to Haitian immigrants. So it's
yes.
a consistent trend.
The sorry, I'm just thinking about how wacky Haitian voodoo is. It's voodoo is a really weird form of magic. It's I don't want to get into it, but it operates under really different principles from other philosophies of magic. Um, and so, Third French Empire in the 19th century, and 19th century France had a real failure to launch because France had a political crisis where no one was able to solidify political authority, where it was constantly batted back and forth between monarchy, republic, aristocratic republic. Even you had even had a Paris became a communist state in the 1870s, and Les Mis, which is one of Les Miserables, one of my favorite books ever. It goes through these different factions between, oh, France is briefly a democracy, oh, it's a monarchy now, oh, another relative. So France went through industrialization, and it was a wealthy and highly cultured country, but it was incapable of breaking through towards political stability, which is why the 19th century was the era of the Pax Britannica, where it was an era of just British excellence and British domination of every major continent on Earth. Well, the French felt profound resentment at this, and the first French colony that they took in the Third Empire was Algeria. They took
Mm.
Algeria generations before anyone else. The Americans had opened up Algeria through winning the Barbary Wars, where a group of Americans hired mercenaries, wiped out the Barbary corsairs, which dominated Algeria, Tunis, and Libya, just because the Americans refused to pay the tribute money the rest of the Europeans paid the Barbary corsairs.
Right, which is a big political topic today
Chad
because everyone
move.
always brings it back. But yeah, I like the private fleet go mess them up. It's interesting that the I'm surprised that the colonial European powers didn't wreck the Mediterranean like 200 years before us. You'd think they would have had dominance,
So
navy dominance over the Ottomans.
The Spanish really tried, where the
Mm,
Spanish launched dozens of attacks on the Maghreb, and they failed because keep in mind the Europeans only got a consistent military advantage over the Turks in the 18th century. As late as the 1690s, the Turks could terrify Europe with with the Turkish guns that went up to Vienna. But once you get to Napoleon's era, the Europeans could unilaterally wipe out any Muslim army. And the French took Algeria, and Algeria is a kind of special colony where there were over 1 million European settlers in Algeria in the mid 20th
wow.
century. Algeria was 10% white. So the French had their own settler colonial society, and lots of the cities of Algeria were seen as highly cultured, civilized places where you might as well be in the south of France. Lots of French thinkers were based
Right.
out of there.
Well,
And
it's like the Visigoths. It's a common place for Northern European settlers to set up.
yes, and Algeria was difficult to conquer, where I think it took over 1 million lives to conquer it, and then the Algerian War of Independence was also exceptionally bloody. And the French took a lot of time and effort to conquer Algeria, but after that, Algeria became probably the most important French colony. Then, what happened a generation later in the mid 19th century was that Napoleon the Second, I believe, who was the nephew of Napoleon the original, he made himself monarch of France after the failed democracy.
Hmm.
And so it's not Napoleon the Second, it's Napoleon the Third. Um, Yeah, Napoleon the Third. Napoleon the Third was a monarch of France, and he tried a lot of different schemes because he was trying to build up a French empire to compete with the British, where he invaded
Hmm.
Mexico during the time of the U.S. Civil War, where the French, under a Habsburg king. They got a European Habsburg to become the emperor of Mexico. They seized Mexico City, they seized Veracruz. But the issue was that the French were not willing to get involved in local warlord disputes that would have allowed them to conquer Mexico. And the local Mexican elite, the local Mexican conservative elite supported the French's conquest. But also, the Americans, after the end of the U.S. Civil War, threatened militarily to cross the Rio Grande to Mexico, and the French
Hmm.
military
Right.
left upon that threat, leaving Maximilian in Mexico to be killed.
Right. And that reminds me of why did the Spanish and the French never team up because they feared the English more?
They
Like
did.
they did, okay. But
Yeah.
not too directly, like you said that the French expected some treaty from the Spanish and they didn't give it to them.
Over the 18th century, um, over the 18th century, the French and the Spanish were consistently allies because they were both under the Bourbon monarchy, where the end point
Uh,
of the War of Spanish Succession was that the Spanish ended up under the French ruling family. What happened, though, is that from the 17th to the 18th centuries, Spain became so pathetic that its ally status was useless. Spain went from
hmm,
the greatest power in the world to a complete joke over the course of the 17th century. So the French got very little practical benefit from working with the Spanish.
got it. And then it makes sense that Italy was the first place Napoleon conquered because France had been stomping through Italy since the 1400s and it was
Yeah.
even weaker than Spain. It was a natural kind of starting point.
Napoleon was also ethnically Italian, which adds
Right.
another weird variable onto it. And
Columbus.
yes, Italians have done much. And so Napoleon the Third also he was trying to conquer Italy as well, to speak to your point, where Napoleon the Third controlled Rome, and
Mm,
he finally gave Rome to the Italians in exchange for Savoy, or a border area around the French-Italian frontier. Um, but Napoleon the Third's endeavors were largely failures, and he was kicked out of power with the Franco-Prussian War. And the Franco-Prussian War is the real start to the third French Empire, where Bismarck got France to declare war on Germany so that he could use the external threat to unify all the German states together and to create modern Germany. Then he crushed the French at the Battle of Sedan and then even seized Paris, where this was complete humiliation for France. And Paris became a communist state after the government fell apart, which is interesting because it's funny to see communism in the 1870s, which was decades of the rise of the Soviet Union. And that had a
Right.
huge impact on Nietzsche's philosophy, actually, because
Wow.
Nietzsche followed it closely. And it's how Nietzsche predicted the age of the last men, because he saw how left wing the French were already. Um,
Well, this is so much like the World War II because the first Marxist political party was created in Germany in 1870.
yeah.
So and just like when the German National Socialists invaded France, in the 1940s, very similar to the late 1800s, where they were both kind of actually pro-Marxist. The north of France was very amenable to National Socialism. There was like National Socialist parties throughout all these countries, which became the rulers. And the south of France was very different from that. So this like German French, Northern French German ideological compatibility, where they're not even actually upset about the ideology of their invaders, is kind of a consistent pattern.
Yeah. France of this era was highly politically polarized. The average Frenchman was super socially conservative, where late 19th century France was a very socially conservative society because from Napoleon onwards, the military had become the dominant ruling class of France, where France was run by the bureaucracy but mediated through the military, through a bureaucratized military. And an example of this is the Dreyfus case at the end of the 19th century, which was a huge social issue in France, where the French military had falsely convicted a Jewish officer for being a German spy. And there was a lot of anti Semitism around this story, why the French liberals reacted against this. This became a huge polarizing issue because for the French conservatives, this was an insult to the honor of the military, where even to insinuate the military could do something wrong was an insult to the French nation. And for the liberals, they saw this as a breach in justice because Dreyfus got sent out to French Guiana, which was a very lightly populated jungle territory next to Brazil. France's largest border in the world is with Brazil, actually. And so Devil's Island, which is this horrific jungle prison that the French sent their worst criminals to, and
Mm.
it eventually turned out that Dreyfus was innocent. And this was a huge loss for the cultural right in France, and it was a huge victory for the cultural left. But the cities were largely socialist or urban, where France had the biggest population of communists or socialists of anywhere in Europe, while the countryside was rural. The countryside
Right.
the countryside was very socially conservative, and you did have some classical liberals like Lafayette or de Tocqueville, but they only rarely gained dominance in France. Where at the time of World War One, France was a hyper-militaristic, hyper-nationalist, Catholic conservative country, where France was actually more warlike and more militaristic than Germany was in World War One.
Yeah, totally makes sense. They're very much have that in their history. And the separation between the urban and then the rural, more culturally intact areas is just the same as today and as in Rome, where Augustus was like, "Hey, I'm from a small town." Politicians today are always like, "I grew up in a small town. I'm from a middle class family." It's supposed to show their morality against the urban
Yes.
uh, and I don't think you have that tendency as much in France. I don't think they care as much.
France also went through a huge socially conservative wave in the 19th century, where in the mid 19th century, the average Frenchman was significantly more socially conservative and religious than their grandparents were. Which is
Oh
something
wow.
that French authors of that era touch on between de Tocqueville or Victor Hugo or Gustave Le Bon. And
Uh,
and that happened across Europe. But there was kind of a sense of clarity after the French Revolution of this is not cool. But
Right. So it would have been cool again to be from a small town for a period.
yeah, yeah. The So the Franco-Prussian War was the start of the Third French Empire because the French got completely beaten in that war by superior German military and supplies and even medicine, where the French were completely destroyed and the Germans took Alsace from France, where the Alsace is an ethnically French region. Or it's an ethnically German region that the French conquered in the 17th century, but the French became very attached to the borders of the Hexagon. And Bismarck did not support taking Alsace because he thought it would have the political effects it did.
Right. It's the
But
reverse of Versailles. Yeah.
yes, yes. But the French completely obsessed over Alsace for the next generation, 1871 to 1914. And that was their biggest political issue across France because they saw the loss of Alsace as a defeat of their sacred honor. And
Well,
historians
think
have,
about it. They fought over that. They prioritized that region over their colonies not
yeah,
long ago,
yeah.
like we just talked about.
And historians have argued that the Franco Prussian War was the seminal moment for the scramble for Africa because France started trying to compensate elsewhere for the loss of Alsace, where they started carving out West Africa. And as the French started doing that, the rest of Europe tried to get involved because there was a real FOMO that in the scramble for Africa was not profitable for any European power involved. And it
Mm.
happened within mostly a decade or 20 years, 1888 to 1900, you saw almost all of Africa go from native governance to European governance. And the French spurred that and it created this chain effect where the Belgians took the Congo, then the Germans and the British got involved, and then you have the Treaty of Berlin, which Bismarck organized, of dividing Africa up between the Europeans, which caused a lot of the current border issues because the Europeans never expected these to be independent countries. They were making it out of their own strategic decisions, often based off factually inaccurate information. But the French's big grab was in West Africa, where the French had a huge empire in West Africa,
Mhm.
stretching from the Mediterranean to um, to their former slave trading centers in Ivory Coast and in Senegal, where I said the Third French Empire is based out of Dakar, which was their base for French West Africa, which was a huge territory in modern Senegal. And they grabbed it all pretty quickly. There were several spots where they had scruffles with the English, between the Fashoda, where the French were trying to take Sudan, between Egypt, which the English took. The French were trying to take northern Nigeria, but the English ended up winning there. Um, and so you saw this huge francophone area of Africa that is still French speaking today.
Yeah, it's all the a lot of the immigrants in Paris and France are from that area, West Africa, and they speak French all throughout there. Interesting accent. They still use the currency. I think up until I think recently there were some changes that weakened the French control of the
Yeah,
currency.
the franc
Mhm.
The franc Afrique has become dramatically weaker in the last 5 years due to wokeness, where after the
Mm.
French lost their empire, they kept it indirectly with this huge area of West Africa called the franc Afrique, where their currency is controlled from Paris by the French. The French approve whoever the military dictator is,
Hmm.
and France 5 years ago, they were fighting more than 6 wars in Africa at once, where the French
Right.
military would constantly intervene in Africa. And a lot of it was positive because they were stopping groups like Boko Haram. Boko
Hmm.
Haram's Nigerian, but you've got dozens of groups like them in the Sahel. And it's funny that it was completely ignored that the French have this huge de facto empire until very recently in West Africa, where in the last 5 years, due to wokeness, the French have practically given up their attempts to maintain their power in West Africa.
Right. So now it's being filled in by Russian mercenaries because people don't quite understand how Africa works. A lot of the dictators rely on basically mercenaries and technology from foreign Western, not Western powers, just foreign more advanced powers. So
Yes.
like if you have a fighting Russian squad, right? They have the technology and the capability and the training to dominate an area for a local ruler cheaper than he could do himself.
Yes.
Um, and so that, and then when you have Russia is not woke, so they're all over it. France was in there for a while, and then the U.S. is all over Africa too. But like you said, when it's the direct military has to be involved, and we don't like that, then it's not going to happen. So basically, unless we shift to private, because I doubt we're going to return to direct military action, then it's just that role is going to be filled in by Russia and China and other people.
Yeah. Wonder if Blackwater will get involved. Um, the
If the U.S. government lets them, I think that's the big limiting factor.
I'd prefer them to the Russians.
Right.
Um, the thing with the French Empire in Africa is it's so geographically huge, but I can't really say how it's impacted Western history because the thing with the African colonies is they're huge, and Africa will probably end up becoming an important place. But as I've said before, they were less than 1% of France's foreign trade. And the French built
Hmm.
this huge empire where the French structure of leadership was different from the British because the British would get these aristocrats to send them down out to the colonies, and they'd work with the local chieftains. And the British had indirect rule through the parliamentary tradition done by the locals, and the French technically ran things directly through France, where they had a French bureaucracy, and their goal was the cultural assimilation of the colonies into being French, like the Roman Empire. The French drew a lot of ideas from the Roman Empire, and the French went to a lot of efforts to avoid having direct racial discrimination. They were the best
Hmm.
European power for that. However, there was de facto racial discrimination, and they actually ended up being heavily dependent on local regimes because the French
Right.
weren't capable of governing without the local tribal chieftains. Although you'd have French officials that would pop up, have total authority over the local tribes, then go somewhere else.
Right. It's kind of almost a failure of multiculturalism just because they were trying to extend the Francophonie through getting their culture incorporated in these other areas versus some of the English colonies like Rhodesia or South Africa were more
Yeah.
isolated populations.
It's funny that most histories I read in this topic portray the French method as more humane, but when you zoom out and think about it, you're like, wait, the
It didn't
English
work.
don't the English don't actually care about whether you assimilate or not. The French are actively trying to get you to assimilate under this principle of under this sort of multicultural facade.
Exactly. And it just didn't result in a functioning state. So,
Yeah. Um, the French were worse at establishing institutions than the English were. Where a lot of the poorest countries in the world are former French colonies in the Sahel and West Africa. I don't want to fully
so
blame
maybe it worked too well. They just instituted the wrong culture.
I don't want to blame the French that much for it because when you look at how the French governed versus the Spanish or the Russians or those peoples, it wasn't that bad. The French Empire was fairly humane and competent. Um, I just think that that region of the world, the Sahel, is going to be poor for cultural and climactic and other reasons. Um,
Mhm.
and the the other final French colony we should talk about, the French had Madagascar, which they took from a local sadistic queen, where she did a lot of weird stuff. You should look her up on Wikipedia. And then Vietnam, other French colony, where the French conquered Vietnam and the neighboring countries of Cambodia and Laos in the late 19th century. And it was the most populous French colony, which they held throughout this time period. And it's interesting to see the cultural intermixing, where, as an example, Vietnamese French fusion cuisine is big in France. And there's this there's a real cultural influence from France to Vietnam.
Oh,
And
huge. All their food is French pastry shops, sausages, and rolls, just kind of like sweeter. I
yeah,
mean, they have churches, they have French buildings everywhere. Um,
Pho.
Yeah, but down to their fundamental food culture is very like connected.
The most popular Vietnamese dish in America, pho, it's from the French word feu or fire.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah,
Interesting. The
yeah.
soup, the banh mi is a very famous one because it's a baguette sandwich with shredded, carrots and sweet meat and Asian vegetables.
Yeah. The French were also instrumental in breaking up the political equilibrium that existed beforehand because Thailand had made itself the local power. And then what
Mhm.
happened was the French cut off half of Thailand's territory, gave it to them. Thailand survived as a buffer state between the English and the French, the English in Burma and the French in Vietnam. And um, the French also brought Laos into this shared polity where Laos was they were jungle hill tribes, and Cambodia had gone into decline. But now we have hit World War One, and World War One was a brutal war for France. It killed off so many of their young men. France became a war zone itself. The Germans
Mhm.
nearly took Paris twice. So World War One was just a nightmare for France, and the French ended up pulling significant amounts of African troops from the area around Senegal to make up for their loss of young white men.
Interesting. I didn't know there were Senegalese in the French army in World War One, or
Yeah.
I hadn't. I don't know too much about those stories. How did they fight? How did they incorporate in the army?
So this is one of the weird anthropology facts is the studies the French used to compare the psychological effects of World War One on white versus black soldiers
Hmm.
actually became instrumental to a lot of like ethnic research we have today, where the French put a lot of time and effort to see how black troops fought differently versus white troops and
Hmm.
implementing different tactics and that stuff. Um, and um, and what they consistently found is that the African troops could bear greater physical suffering, but they would face psychological issues faster.
Interesting.
So
Wow.
stuff
Yeah.
like PTSD or the monotony of the front line or the weather, even more so, that had a bigger
Hmm.
toll on African troops than it did for Europeans. But the other thing as well is that although there were African forces, a woke person would get you to believe that there were more than there were. Where,
Right.
for example, you had some Muslims in France in this time period, but you had like one or two mosques in all of France. So there was an African component, but it wasn't like a third of the French army was black.
Right. Yeah. Um, it's just interesting in World War One and World War Two to think of all how many colonial troops were in those wars because it's more than you realize, and they all have a little bit of a different flavor, like the Australians and stuff.
Yeah.
Um,
So the British, they were using their white colonies as shock troops by the end of the war because the British themselves had become so worn down.
mhm.
So they would use Australians and Canadians to launch shock attacks on the Western Front. The French had a Quebecois regiment in World War One,
Ah,
where the British
interesting.
would let them recruit French Canadians to fight for the French, although the French they were the officers. Um, and World War One France is one of the most rapid cultural shifts ever, where France went from this hyper militaristic nationalist country to
Hmm.
after the war being the center of pacifism and nihilism and socialism of everywhere in Europe. You had these two
Right.
psychological tendencies inside France, and you flip from one to the other. And so a lot of the culture we associate with the left today or modernity or Weimar came out of France in the 1920s. Um,
It's the same thing that happened to Germany after World War II, where
yes,
they became nihilistic, super peaceful, like the most woke. Yeah.
yes. And yeah, you're right. And so when World War II started, France had been so overtaken by pacifism that they didn't really fight hard. And um, it's sad that France has been one of the greatest military powers ever, only to get relentlessly mocked for World War II. Because
I think that, yeah, go ahead.
they fought heroically in World War
Right.
One, and the sad thing is that the French commander, who was the hero of World War One, Pétain,
Hmm.
he he became the leader of Vichy France. So their great hero of World War One
Wow.
betrayed them to be the Vichy leader in World War Two.
Oh, well, that makes so much sense because he probably appreciated the Nazis' politics more than the way that the French politics went after World War One.
I
Like he
never
was
thought of
probably
that.
amenable to National Socialism, like so many
Yeah,
of them were. This is like an opportunity to anyone who was a National Socialist welcomed the German invasion because that just
yeah.
put them on the top and they got their ideas um,
I
back. But it's I think it's a really interesting case study, the French reaction to World War Two, World War One, and to World War Two. Because, like you said, they're one of the most militant, established, glory-based, countries ever, and there's something undeniable about watching, a certain percent of your population die in brutal trench warfare over a period of time where you're like, wait a minute, this is it's like the question of it's always worth it. It's like, wait, maybe it's not worth it.
yeah.
And what were the consequences of them doing that? World War II ended for them, and they didn't have as many people die. Maybe it wasn't that bad of an idea.
Yeah, it's funny as well for World War One, where the French dominant theory of war before the war was that the élan, or the spirit of a military, could trounce military advantages. So they thought if an army has
Mm.
enough motivation, it can crush a better army. And they also thought that offense
Um,
would have the advantage in the war. So the French
right,
played their cards in the exact wrong way because World War One was a war where the defense had an enormous advantage, but French military study had been taken up by these theories that motivation and offense would be the way of the future. And so they just got butchered in a way that other
uh,
Europeans were able to adapt faster away from.
right. They probably couldn't philosophically recover from that. They were probably just in
Yeah.
too much of a place of uncertainty because the basis of their entire philosophy was that
Yeah.
cut out from under them. And then it's like, what are we gonna copy what they do, but not as well, and we don't know what to do ourselves.
Yeah.
So it's a bit of frozen through uncertainty.
The other thing as well is that out of any country, France was the one in World War One where the most people died. So it was fighting over the French territory, which a lot of it ended up looking like the moon or Mordor.
Yeah,
And France also lost its dominant industrial base because which was in the northeast of the country. So in World War One, the French were fighting without most of their industry.
yeah, that's not fun at all. So there's a good reason, for them to to make those moves possibly.
So
Um, I
with
forgot how
World
follow up go. Yeah.
With World War II, the Germans launched a strike through the Ardennes, where the French had built up this enormous wall of fortifications called the Maginot Line on their border between France and Germany if Germany invaded again. The Germans just bypassed the wall, attacked through the forest, and it hit the French from behind. Then after that, in 1940, the French lost within a matter of the weeks, giving up when the Germans seized Paris. And the French have been ruthlessly mocked for this, while parts of the French Empire followed the Vichy government with Pétain, and then other parts went with de Gaulle, where de Gaulle was a French officer. I don't think he was particularly important. He was in one of the colonies, either Syria or Gabon, where he said, I am the new French leader. All those who support free France should follow me. And I think Syria, Gabon, and maybe somewhere else went for the Free French, but most of the
Hmm.
French Empire actually sided with Vichy. So
Right.
the French could have reformulated in Algeria and kept the war going there. Instead, all of French West Africa, the Maghreb, and Madagascar went for the French, the Vichy government. Its name's
Hmm.
Vichy as it's based out of the town of Vichy, and it controlled the southern half of France. Well, the Japanese took Vietnam instantaneously. Vietnam fell into communist insurgencies where the same Vietnamese army which fought the Japanese later beat the French at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, killing the French Empire, and then beat the Americans in the Vietnam War. It was the same guys.
Right. It's interesting to think of the north of France so consistently dominating the south progressively for such a long time that the fact that the north aligned with the Germans was put the south in a position of like moral superiority relative to the nation of France for the first time and maybe since they were conquered by the North.
I
And I wonder, yeah, go ahead.
I think that just the shame of of collaborating with, whenever I say collaborating, I think of YouTubers collaborating. So whenever I hear collaborating with the Nazis, I think Hitler featuring Pétain, or it's like
Right.
Vichy
That's
France
funny.
featuring Goring. And I just imagine it's a YouTube video with creators collabing. But there was a
Right.
tremendous amount of shame because you'll see that people who you thought you could trust will actually betray the system and support conquerors. And so it created this sense for decades afterwards. And one of my favorite TV shows, Au Service de la France, which is about
Hmm.
the French Secret Service in the 1960s, is people are very careful to cover up their collaboration with the Nazis.
Right.
And
It's the
I
same thing as France and Germany. Like post-war period is very internal shame because they had, a lot of collaborators.
and the other thing on top of that is that um, the a lot of Sartre's philosophy and the postmodernist philosophy is, and which came
Mm.
out of France in the post World War II period, is that we're all offered a stark choice in life whether we follow meaning or not. And I heard an interesting philosopher say that that's an outcome of France in World War II. You were given a choice: do you work with the Nazis or not? And so it was this real
Mm.
moral test.
Right. Because for some of them, it was a practical thing. For some of them, they were opportunistic, betrayers. You have the whole spectrum because in many situations, you're not really given the choice. But I wonder if it created a revival in French culture towards the South post-war, like or like Asterix and Obelix against the Roman occupiers, um,
Not
things
really.
like that. And well, yeah, probably not. But it's curious to think about. And then going to school in France. One of the reasons why we moved back to the U.S. was I came home from school one day and was like, "Hey, Dad, did you know without the French resistance, we would have never won World War II?"
Oh,
So there's still these sense of shame at the same time that maybe it was a good idea, but it gets translated through the merit of the French. They get to have it both ways, right?
yes.
Oh, but it's from the perspective of the North versus the South, because the South fought and the North didn't.
Yeah. When I was a kid and I was reading a French history book, it said the exact same thing. That the
No
French,
way.
no, really, yeah.
Yeah,
It said that and this was a book written in French, and I've read French history since, where they're operating under the delusion that they are the reason France is liberated. Where, for a
yeah,
frame of reference, the army which conquered France at D-Day and Normandy, pushing across all of France, was almost entirely Canadian, American, and British. There was not barely even any French troops. The only French troops were under the Leclerc division, which the Americans allowed the Leclerc division to liberate Paris for symbolic reasons, but they did not do the fighting. The reason the French gained independence is the Anglo-Saxons conquered France, and the
right.
French cope a lot about that even today.
And sure, they helped. Like, I'm glad you told us where the infrastructure was and did some sabotage and things like that. And
Yeah.
I'm proud of your valiant effort, but of course, yeah, it's not all that it took.
After the war, the French were one of the European countries that tried to maintain their empire the best. They lasted for a few years longer than the British Empire, where the British just gave up. But the French did not. They lost at Dien Bien Phu, which was a battle in the jungle mountains of Vietnam,
Mm,
where they were fighting over airstrips, and the Vietnamese guerrillas were able to surround the French armies based around the airstrips and just murder them. So the French lost a field army in Vietnam, which forced them to give up their Southeast Asian empire, which then got split between North and South, capitalist versus communist. America got involved. It's all part of a single historic process. But then the
yeah,
loss in Dien Bien Phu resulted in Algeria rebelling. And the war in Algeria was horrible, where the French fought for years and they finally succeeded at crushing the war in Algeria. And Charles de Gaulle was the president of France at the end of this war, and he made the decision we're going to hold on to Algeria. No, he made that decision first. Then he made the decision we're going to lose Algeria, and this sparked
Right.
a crisis in France where the left was violently against keeping Algeria, and then when de Gaulle made the decision to work with the left, although he was a conservative, there
Hmm.
was a military coup where former Algerian soldiers tried to launch a coup against de Gaulle, and that ultimately failed. But there was this constitutional crisis in France in the 60s, which we forget can happen in a modern Western country. France moved from the Fourth Republic to the Fifth Republic.
Right. And what were the political implications of that legal system?
So France gave up all the empire, where after the loss
Right.
of Algeria, they gave up all the African colonies, and France just became progressively more gay and effeminate, which is the path of
Hmm.
all West European countries over the 20th century, where France. France has tried to resist being a part of the American empire. They're the one European country that pushes back against it the most,
Yeah,
besides
yeah, yeah.
Russia, of course. But France has been sucked more so into the American and the European orbit. Whereas a symbol for this, the European Union, an organization made by the Americans, no, literally, it was built by
Yeah, no, I
Americans.
know. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and God, that was not a smart idea. We were so naive.
Hmm.
And now the European Union hates us. But so they started working with the Germans, and the European Union started over a coal and industrial manufacturing treaty between France and Germany, which later spiraled out to be the European Union. And so France became part of the European Union's empire after they lost their colonial empire, and in the European Union, you could see it as an alliance of Germany's industrial power and force of will with the French's pre-established imperial skills, as well as the French were more socially palatable after World War II. So the Germans and the French worked together to keep the European Union, where the French were the
Hmm.
public-facing side and the Germans were the machine behind it.
Right. So they basically didn't even break up after World War II. They
Yeah, it's
kept
it.
together as pretty strong allies.
Um, when I was in high school, I wrote 500 pages of fantasy lore when I was bored in class. The teachers thought I was taking notes. And in one of those fantasy lores, there's two kingdoms called Avalentium and Snare that are ethnically close to identical, but one of them pick a different religion and the other one picks a different religion, and they wage
Hmm.
centuries of internecine warfare, and they periodically form together under different incentives. And the point I was trying to
Hmm.
make there is that, like the Germans and the French, who are ethnically very close but picked different ideologies or different powers, that among culturally comparable peoples, there is the potential for both intense hatred and cooperation. Where there have been points when the French and the Germans worked together and also killed each other, I think that's symbolic of the human condition.
Yeah, I mean, you can see this example with your friends or people on your sports team or something. You
Yeah.
have stronger opinions about them than people on the other team. And then, yeah, it's funny how with the EU, it's like it always starts with free trade and then ends in a centralized globalist regulatory bureaucracy or something.
Yes.
Um, and, but that's another example of like shared ideology and cooperation between France and Germany. And it's funny with France because it's like they were embarrassed about World War II. So they were too embarrassed to just give up their colonies after that. So they needed to fight these big wars just so that it was their choice to give up their colonies. Like,
Yes,
we're not
exactly.
doing this because you're making us. Yeah. We could hold on to our colonies if we want to, but we're nice.
Yeah.
Um, which is funny. That's a relevant psychological theme because you're not good unless you have the strength to make that decision, right?
Yes. Huh. So that's the French Empire. Next episode is the Napoleonic Wars.
Very cool. I'm excited. Yeah, and then I'll be curious to break down like how it went from the Republicans briefly after the crazy
Yeah.
revolutionaries and how they failed to achieve progress, which left room for Napoleon.
You will get 7 hours of French excellence in a 3 week period.
Very cool. All right.
Bye.
Vive la France.